Mr. Majewski's Anatomy 32 class lecture, Chapter 18, Part 3, Cerebellum, Diencephalon, and the Cranial Nerves. So, as we talked about before, the brainstem is actually right adjacent to the cerebellum. So these two brain structures are actually connected, and lying between them is that fourth ventricle. So, let's talk about some parts of the cerebellum. Well, there's the cerebellar cortex. Basically, there's a lot of gray matter along the outside of the cerebellum that is arranged in a series of slender parallel ridges, and these are called folia, kind of like leaves. And this is because there's also this white area on the inside of the cerebellum that is been called the arbor vitae, or the tree of life. And basically, it's because the white matter looks kind of like it's branching out like branches of a tree. If you look on the outside of the cerebellum, you see that on the posterior side, you can see what's called the vermis, which is a constricted center area between the two cerebellar hemispheres, connecting the two hemispheres. There's also an anterior and posterior lobes, front and back. And these help govern subconscious aspects of skeletal muscle control, such as muscle tone. And then you have the flocculonodular lobes, which are more in the middle area, and they're involved in equilibrium and balance. Then there's the cerebellar punducles. This is the part of the cerebellum that attaches to the brainstem. And the inferior cerebellar pundicle carries sensory information into the cerebellum. The middle area carries impulses for voluntary movements to the pons, and then the superior cerebellar pundicle has more axons that extend into the midbrain and to the thalamus, sending out and receiving information. A possible disorder, if your cerebellum is damaged, is ataxia, which is a loss of coordination of muscular movements. So, for instance, someone who's blindfolded is unable to touch their nose, or similar as being drunk, where if you're drunk you have trouble controlling your movements as you're walking and so forth. Well, the same could happen, although not as much fun, if the cerebellum is damaged. Now we talk about the diencephalon. The diencephalon is superior to the brainstem. It's approximately here. I like to think of it as the head and mouth of the seahorse, and it is completely surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres. The diencephalon has three major parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So let's start with talking about the thalamus. So here's the thalamus. It's this large ovular egg-like structure. It is a major relay station for sensory impulses, except for smell, and for motor functions. And it also possesses nuclei involved in awareness, in memory, and in emotions. So the thalamus is a major player in sending information where it needs to go. And then there's the intermediate mass, shown as a little circle dot here, and that's basically the structure that connects the two halves of the thalamus, because obviously we have a right thalamus and a left thalamus. The hypothalamus is sort of the mouth of the seahorse, and it controls many body activities, and especially the regulation of homeostasis, or keeping our body functions at the ideal conditions for a healthy life. This includes things like control of autonomic nervous system through hormone production. It's involved in the regulation of emotional and behavioral patterns. It can control or regulate if you're hungry or thirsty, body temperature, circadian rhythms, and various states of consciousness, such as being asleep or awake or completely unconscious. Then there's the epithalamus. It's sort of this little curve or comma superior to the thalamus, and at the very posterior end of the epithalamus is the pineal gland. Also included within the epithalamus is the habenular nuclei, which is involved in olfaction or smell. Since again, smell does not go through the thalamus, but it does go partly through the epithalamus. Also found in the diencephalon is what's called circumventricular organs, and these are little structures that lie in the walls of the third ventricle, so down here around where the thalamus is, and its job is to help monitor changes in blood chemistry and then send that information on should there need to be some sort of adjustment to keep us healthy. The cranial nerves. There are 12 cranial nerves, and we need to know all of them. 3 of these nerves only carry sensory information from our special senses, such as vision, hearing, taste, that sort of thing. And that's 1, 2, and 8. We have some of these are only motor nerves. They only send out signals to control muscle movement. And this is 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12. And then there's mixed nerves. These nerves have both motor neurons and sensory neurons running through them. And that's 5, 7, 9, and 10. But we're going to go through each of these on their own. So here's just another image of how the nerves are arranged. As you can see, they go from both anterior to posterior as well as superior to inferior. So, olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve is linked to the olfactory receptors found in the superior portion of the nasal cavity. So it turns out that the receptors are also the olfactory neurons, and they then signal through the cribriform plate up to the olfactory bulb, which is technically considered part of the brain. There they'll go through synapsing, and the signal will be sent on directly to the primary olfactory area in the temporal lobe of the cerebral cortex. So again, olfactory bypasses the thalamus, goes straight to its primary olfactory area. Then there's the optic nerve. This is receiving signals from the stimulus of the retina. In this case, the receptors are different from the optic neurons. So once a signal is sent, the optic signal is sent out of the eye toward the brain. There's a crossing over effect at what's referred to as the optic chiasm, which reorganizes the information so that your medial parts of your vision switch sides. And then that signal is sent through the thalamus, as you can see here, and then on to the visual cortex, primary visual area at the back of the head. So, if you have anosmia, that means you have lost your ability to smell. This can be caused by serious infections of the nasal mucosa, damage to the cribriform plates, or lesions along the olfactory pathway. If you have anopia, that means you have blindness, and this can be caused by many things, including the cutting of or damage to the optic nerves, and depending on where that damage is, can affect what portion of your field of vision no longer functions. Alright, we have oculomotor nerve 3, trochlear nerve 4, and abducens nerve 6. These nerves all control muscles that control the movement of the eyeball. So the oculomotor nerve, number 3, it controls the function of the superior rectus, medial rectus, inferior rectus, and inferior oblique muscles of the eye, plus the muscle that helps control the upper eyelid. And also it has some autonomic motor functions for the lens and the iris. The trochlear nerve controls the contractions of the superior oblique muscle, and the abducens nerves controls contractions of the lateral rectus muscle. So these 3 nerves are what help us control our eye movement. Now, if you have strabismus or lazy eye, this means that there's damage to one or more of these nerves, which prevents your eyes from being able to focus and fix on one object together. And instead, one is more inward or outward than the other. There's diplopia, which is double vision, which can be caused by damage to any of these nerves because your eyes are perhaps shaking as they try to focus on one thing. And ptosis, which is the drooping of the upper eyelid, which is only found when there's damage to the oculomotor nerve. Trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve is named because it quickly branches into 3 very significant nerve branches. It is a mixed nerve, so it has sensories neurons for touch, pain, and thermal sensation, and also it controls muscles that are involved in chewing. If you have damage to your trigeminal nerve, you can get trigeminal neuralgia, which is where you can feel a sharp cutting or tearing pain anytime there's a light touch to your face that also is contacting an area that the trigeminal nerve is in charge of. There's the facial nerve, another mixed nerve. It receives sensory neurons from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, so it brings in signals for taste. And this, of course, goes through the thalamus. It also has motor neurons that innervate the middle ear, facial, scalp, and neck muscles. So if it's damaged, you could get Bell's palsy, where you have paralysis of the facial muscles. And it also controls some autonomic functions, including lacrimal glands for tearing, nasal glands for mucus production, palatine glands for salivation, sublingual and submandibular salivary glands as well. So it's a pretty important nerve. But they all are. Next is the vestibuloocular nerve, or number 8. This nerve carries information for both equilibrium and hearing, and it originates in the pons and sends information to the cerebellum as well. So here you can see the inner ear, and the nerves have 2 branches, one for equilibrium, one for hearing, that then quickly fuse to form the vestibuloocular nerve. And if this is damaged, you can have vertigo, which is a feeling that your body or the environment is always moving. You can have ataxia, which is the difficulty in voluntary control of muscle movements. Nystagmus, which is involuntary rapid movement of the eye. Because your equilibrium is off, your eye's trying to adjust. It can cause tinnitus, which is ringing the ears, and, of course, deafness. Next is the glossopharyngeal nerve. This is a mixed cranial nerve, so it gets sensory information. It's involved in some of the taste buds in the back of the tongue, the last third of the posterior portion of the tongue. It also has receptors for things like monitoring blood pressure or monitoring the chemical contents of the blood. And it also is involved with sort of the external ears, things like touch, pain, and temperature feel. And the motor functions include the stylopharyngeus muscle, which is involved for swallowing, as well as anatomic control of the parotid gland for producing saliva. So if this is damaged, you can get dysphagia, which is difficult to swallow, aptilia, which is reduced secretion of saliva, and aguasia, which is loss of taste sensation. Then there's the vagus nerve. This is a cranial nerve that is mixed, has both sensory and motor functions. It is the only cranial nerve that sends signals down into the trunk of the body to the visceral organs there. It is important for visual sensory sensations such as hunger, fullness, discomfort. It also goes to parts of the skin for the external ear and some of the taste buds and baroreceptors, and also proprioceptors for the neck, so you know about how your neck is turned or bent. And it's involved in motor controls such as swallowing, vocalization, and coughing. And so it's a very, very important nerve. And if you have damage to the vagus nerve, you may get vagal paralysis, which means you have trouble getting the sensations of your organs in the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So, for instance, you may never be able to tell if you're hungry or not. Dysphagia, difficulty swallowing, tachycardia, increased heart rate, that sort of thing. Then we have the accessory nerve. It is a motor nerve only, and it controls the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles found in the neck and back that help to coordinate head movement. And with paralysis of this, or damage to this nerve, can lead to paralysis of the sternocleidomastoid muscle or the trapezius muscle, which would make it difficult to raise your shoulders, make it difficult to turn your head. And then there's hypoglossal nerve, which is another cranial nerve. And it sends out muscles to signals to control things like the muscles in the tongue and around the tongue that help control the movement of the tongue. And so disorders associated with it would be dysarthria, which is difficulty in speaking, and dysphagia, which is difficulty in swallowing. Finally, there's this disorder called Reyes syndrome, which is characterized by vomiting and brain dysfunction, can lead to personality change and even death. And it usually occurs after a viral infection, especially the flu, in children or teens who have also taken aspirin. Weird little disorder, and I thought I'd just throw that out so you could learn all about it. Hope you enjoyed the final portion of the Chapter 18 lectures.